books to page 83. We're going to take up the story of Esther and see how God used a set of circumstances in the book. Brother May, and I'm not finding fault in anything. I just don't particularly care for the word coincidence, because I don't think anything that God does is just coincidence. I'd rather use the word circumstances. Okay, so we see a set of circumstances, as we did see last week in Joseph's life. We're going to see a set of circumstances in Esther's life that that demonstrate God's providential care for His people throughout all of history. Excuse me. So, if you have your Bibles open to the book of Esther, excuse me. Read the lesson. So we're not going to read the book in its entirety on that part of Esther, but we will be referring to it, as well as we want to talk about some significant things that are revealed in the book, and perhaps some things that sometimes we can just read over. We can read over, and we read over them quickly. We don't really stop and think about perhaps there's a profound or an underlying message that it would be valuable for us to consider. And as we said, this particular part of Brother May's book about God's providence has two times when there was a set of circumstances that might have led to the demise of God's people. Back in Genesis, of course, 37 through 50 is the story of Joseph and the rise of Joseph into a position where he saved Jacob, aka Israel, and the entire family from being, so to speak, wiped off, in their case, through famine. And now in Esther's case, we're going to see another situation where God's people were threatened with extinction, so to speak, because of because of the evil of a particular part of the Persian Achaemenid Empire that might have led to their demise through an edict that was issued that would bring about the death to all Jews. By way of historical context, by the way, in your Bible, the story of Esther, the events in the story of Esther that we read about would be, if you go back to the book of Ezra, it would be between the 6th and the 7th chapter. Historically, that would be the biblical historical setting. The historical setting, just as an overview, is while the Jews are in Babylonian captivity or Persian captivity, they are in exile there. A few of them have gone back and have gone back to, and this was the kingdom of Judah, okay, that was led into Babylonian captivity. God allowed them to be led into Babylonian captivity, Persian captivity. And we'll talk about some of those implications here in just a minute, because that's what this entire book of Esther is about. But this particular empire was one that was initially not very, obviously, not very friendly to the Jews, to the Israelites, obviously, since they took them into captivities, and this would have been the Assyrians that would have been involved here. But as the book pointed out at the very beginning, I think I brought it up to you last week. If you want the historical perspective of how the Jews ended up in this captivity. You can read specifically um, the between, as I said, Ezra, the 6th and the 7th chapter, and you'll get that particular captivity. But at any rate, the empire has evolved, so to speak, and we're now in a period when Xerxes the First was the king of the Persian Empire, and he started his reign in about 485, 486 BC, and he did reign for about 20 years. And Xerxes, of course, was his Greek name. Ahasuerus was would be his name in Hebrew, which was both of those names being transliterations of his Persian name of Shayarsha, has a very peculiar Arabic spelling, so it doesn't. There would be no way to sound like what we would think it would be, but nevertheless, that was what he is known by in the Bible would be Ahasuerus or Xerxes the First. So, again, this is relating to the Jews that chose not to go back to their homeland, so to speak. They chose in fact, the majority of them decided to stay where they were under the captivity of the Persian king. And why necessarily they wanted to stay there is not really clear. But we do know that because they did stay there, there was a set of circumstances that was set up where God exercised his providence in their lives to bring about three things, or to demonstrate three things that relates to when God's people, and the best way for me to describe it is the book of Esther is another good example of what we say nowadays is that God never deserts us, we desert him. And Esther is a good example as to what we're talking about, because the book Esther is about when God, the expression, it's a biblical expression that says that God hid himself from them, which simply means that because of their disobedience, they were led into captivity, and it was not apparent that God was directly involved in their lives because they were not they first of all, they were involved in idolatry, okay, but also that they were not particularly keen on being obedient to him and taking advantage of his care and concern for them. In fact, an interesting note is that the name Esther, the name Esther shares the root with a word Hester, which means hidden or concealed. And even though Esther's name, her original Hebrew name was Hadassah, the name Esther means myrtle or myrtle tree, okay, which has on it a very sweet, I don't know if you've been that part of the country and you know what a myrtle tree is, but it has a very sweet white blossom on it. So there's some implications of that sweet aroma, and of course white being pure, a evidence of purity. So the other things that her name would symbolize would be joy, peace, and things of that nature that considering the circumstances that they were in, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on right off. But I want to share with you some of the Jewish traditions that are related to the book of Esther. The book of Esther was a part of the Hebrew writings, quote unquote, that became part of the book of the Hebrews, the Hebrew Bible, that needed to be read over and over and over again to the Jewish people. And and part of that, if you look at the Jewish traditions and writings, they admit that three things: that Esther, for them, was an admission that the consequences that they were going through, their Babylonian captivity, was because of their own disobedience. They recognized that, okay, historically. It was also clear that what the book of Esther points out too is that not only did God hid himself from them, not only because of the consequences for disobedience, but it was also to allow human free choice without anybody being able to see any coercion on the part of God, to allow human free will choice to make the right decisions. To either make the right decisions about who they belong to or to do what was right, no matter what the surrounding circumstances may have told them. And it was also, and the Jewish tradition also tells them that the book of Esther was to teach future generations how to find God's providence acting quietly behind the scenes, behind natural events, rather than through obvious or open miracles. And as you read the book of Esther, hopefully everybody's read the book preparatory to today, you see that it is a set of circumstances which Brother May describes as links, one link to the other. And these circumstances led to, instead of the Jewish nation, the Israelites, being wiped off of the face of the earth, it led to their salvation, okay, from a Persian edict that once made the rule was that once a Persian king made an edict, that it had to be carried through. And through some evil circumstances, and we introduced two characters by the name of Haman, who was one of these that Charles and I, in our career in the Marine Corps, we have a term for them, who basically cozy up to the higher ups to get out of it what they can get out of it, to the detriment of everybody else that is around them, but had forced himself, so to speak, into the good graces of the king, so that he had a position where he could sort of make edicts be realized throughout the Jewish nation, and the king was bound by it because he was the king's right-hand man, so to speak. Okay? Much like we saw, of course, in the story of Joseph, with Joseph being at the right hand of the Pharaoh. And so what is taking place here is that what is taking place is a series of circumstances where the Persian king decides to have this week-long feast, so to speak, this this week-long festival. And during that festival, certain things happen. And one of the things that really became obvious to me is on page 84. Well, it became apparent to me, I should say, not obvious, or else I would have picked up on it right off the bat. But on page 84, in that first paragraph, I want you to. So what has happened is the uh, the king Ahasuerus is having this big festival at which he's entertaining all the notables, all the bigwigs and princes, etc. Okay? And on the seventh day, the Bible says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Is that not the Bible telling us about the evils of using alcoholic beverages to excess, especially? Okay? Very subtle, again, a very subtle teaching. But as they say, he decided that he was going to show off, so to speak. And he apparently had a very beautiful wife, the name of Vashti. And he wanted to parade her in front of all of these notables and kings to show him what a trophy wife he had. Well, his wife says, "No way, I'm not doing that." She was of course entertaining all the women at the same time. Well, one thing that you don't do is you don't defy what the king says to do. And so the Persian law, or the tradition, would be that she had to be punished, even though she was the king's wife, and that usually involved capital punishment. You're usually put to death. But perhaps because the king recognized that he probably should have never issued that edict in the first place, he shouldn't have said it in the first place, decided just to depose her as his queen and look for a new queen. And as it turned out, Esther, there was a young Jewish maiden who was uh, in the harem, quote unquote, of the king, who was being prepped, as they say, at this time. And what that was it was a year-long preparation of very beautiful women into the specific service of the king at his pleasure. But and Esther was adopted by her cousin, her first cousin, by the name of Mordecai, okay, who was among the Jews, one of the notables of the Jews. And as it turned out, Esther was chosen by the king to take Vashti's place, became his wife, so to speak, became his new queen. Because of the evilness of Haman, of course, became very jealous of things because of the favoritism that was shown sometimes to the Jews. There was um, uh, a plot to kill the king, which Mordecai thwarted by telling the king's servants about. And so that was thwarted. Haman didn't like the fact that Mordecai would not bow down to him and show homage to him. And that enraged Haman. And every time Mordecai did it, he became even more enraged. So, because of that, Haman issued an edict, or plotted, I should say, to have all the Jews, not just Mordecai, all of the Jews killed. Well, who would that have included? Esther. See? So Mordecai started taking action to see that that didn't happen. And the only way to do that, of course, was to get to the king. And it was very difficult for just a common, ordinary person to approach the king. Mordecai talked to Esther and convinced her that she was the best, she had the best shot, so to speak, at getting to the king to let him know about this plot to kill all the Jews. Mordecai, obviously knowing that if the king knew that all the Jews were going to be killed, it involved his wife also, which he would, of course, not put up with. Well, it turned out that that the king was having a sleepless night, and he was reading in the archives, and just by that it just means each day the eunuchs and the other scribes within his household would, of course, record all the events of the day, many of which he wouldn't even be aware of unless he read the archives. Well, in the archives, he read that Mordecai had thwarted the plot to kill the king, and he realized that Mordecai had never been issued a place of, had never been honored for doing that. So he decided that he was going to honor Mordecai. Well, evil Haman, who was at the direct service of the king, came. Haman, the king asked Haman to come into him. He had something he wanted to go over with him, and he disguised it in a way in such it was he never used any names. So while Haman, in his egomaniacal way, was thinking that the king was talking about honoring him because of his service to the king, didn't realize that he was actually talking about doing it for Mordecai. And so the king asked Haman what should be done. And so Haman came up with this big long list of different ways to be honored. Royalty, treating him with royalty, etc. And so the king said, okay, so it shall be. And then the king revealed to Haman that it was to be done for Mordecai, not for him. And of course, again, he's enraged. And there's a time when Mordecai tells Esther about, but it didn't stop Haman from this plan to annihilate all the Jews. So let's go to Esther, the 4th chapter, and we're going to read some very important verses there. We're going to start in verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes into the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter. That's acceptance by the king that you have an opportunity to speak to me. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Even though she was his wife, she had never had the boldness to approach the king to speak about to him. And then verse 12, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Mordecai wanted Esther to be the person to bring the attention to the king what was about to happen. Verse 13, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. Again, reminding her, you're a Jew also. So if they annihilate the Jews, that means you also. But here's the important thing, verse 14. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. but you and your father's house will perish. So Mordecai knows and remembers the promise that was made to Abraham many, many years ago about how his people would never go to extinction. But with this edict that's been made here, while you're in captivity, this means that, you know, God will take care of all the rest of the Jews, but you're going to die along with the other Jews that are here in captivity. And then look at a very famous verse here. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In other words, what he's saying is, how do you not know that God put you where you are specifically to save the Jews? Just like Joseph was placed in a position to save the Jews. And so that's Mordecai telling Esther, be courageous. You're the only one right now that can save us from perishing. You need to have the courage to approach the king because you're the only one that can do it. Mordecai knowing fully two things: God's promise, and the second thing is that the king of Persia does not allow anyone to speak to him, especially the Jews, unless he wants you to. And so Mordecai is telling Esther, you need to be the one to do it because you've been put in this place by God to do this. And so Esther does just that. Through a little bit of, she kind of goes in a roundabout way, so to speak. But she invites the king to a dinner one night, and the king figures out, well, wait a minute, you didn't just invite me to dinner. She says, well, I want you to come the next night. I want you to come back for dinner the next night. When he comes back the second night is when she reveals to the king what Haman is up to. And the night that the king was, by the way, going back a little bit, Haman had been urged by his wife because of Mordecai to build gallows and hang him on those gallows. So the night that the king had a sleepless night was at the same time when Haman was building the gallows to hang Mordecai the next day. So anyway, Esther reveals to the king what Haman is up to. When the king finds out about it, he's livid. He's enraged. He storms out of the room. Well, here's old Haman now. He ain't so courageous anymore because he starts, what does he do? He starts begging to Esther for his own life. And he did it in such a way that when he did it and the king came back into the room, the king thought he was assaulting his wife, the queen. And the king became even more enraged. Well, what's the offense for assaulting the king's queen? Death. And so what happens to Haman? But how? The gallows that he was building for Mordecai. He was hanged on that same gallows. So as a set of circumstances all played out, God in his providential care took care of saving the Jews or allowing the set of circumstances to preserve the Jewish nation, even though they were still in captivity, and even though, as the expression goes, God had hid himself from them because they were acting in disobedience to him. They were involved in idolatry in this new country, etc. God keeps his promises, and Mordecai, being the devout Jew that he was, made sure that no human man ever received the homage that he felt only God deserved. In fact, uh, there's a set of uninspired writings, okay, called the Apocrypha, which was an addition. And in there, in the story, and in the story of this particular set of circumstances, there is a writing that says that Mordecai was seen praying to God, and in that prayer, he specifically said, not only did he ask for God's continuing care for him, but he said, I refuse to ever pay homage or honor to any man that only you, God, deserve. And so, through the set of circumstances of Mordecai and Esther and their allegiance, continuing allegiance to God, did God create a set of circumstances that brought about the salvation of the Jews. This was the second time that God was acting behind the scenes, so to speak, and allowed mankind, specifically the Jews and the Persians, to exercise their free will to make whatever choices they wanted to make. And in Mordecai's case and in Queen Esther's case, they made the right choice. And that was to stay true to God and to stay true to only God. And that's the way that God exercised his providential care in both of those set of circumstances. Joseph in his life and his family, which was the beginning of the Israelite nation, and then Esther and Mordecai's life. And a lot needs to be said about Mordecai too, because Mordecai, it was obvious, was a man who was very strong in his faith also. And had it not been for his urging, who knows whether or not Esther would have been bold enough, so to speak, to go to the king. But it was because of Mordecai, who was her adopted father, even though he's a first cousin, his adopted father, and so she looked up to him. Esther, by the way, even though there is some debate about how old she actually was, it was typical during these times for this group of women that were being groomed. Thank you. I was searching for being groomed to the king's pleasure to be in the range of teenagers, anywhere from 14 to 18. Well, Mordecai was obviously a grown man because he was known as a noble and as a prince among the Jews at this time. And so obviously when he adopted Esther, Esther looked up to him, and of course he was a father figure for her, right? Even though he was a first cousin because of their age difference, much like the age difference between myself and Aaron. Okay? And that's it. So here in these two stories, we see how God can operate even though we may not, or God's people do not always do what is right and may act in sometimes very egregious ways of disobedience, whether it be idolatry or something else. God never forgets his people. Never forgets his people. And all he wants is for them to return to him. And I don't think that's any different than what's today. Okay? We know that even within the Church of Christ, there are congregations that have gone a direction that they ought not to be going. Well, God hasn't deserted them. What God wants is for them to get back to where they need to be. And so it is not only is it a degree of solace to us, but it's also a degree of comfort to know that when we do what we're supposed to do, God will take care of us. We may not all realize how it's going to work out, but remember Romans 8:28, right? Romans 8:28. God will cause things to work together for good. To whom? Not to everybody, to his people. Okay? Those who are called according to what? According to his purpose. And as long as we stay true to him, he will take care of us. Yes, Irene. Go ahead, read it. Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. No matter what the possible circumstances are, it's up to God's people to stand strong. Okay? Thank you very much. Next week, our new minister, Bobby, will take over the class. So, Bobby, any special instructions for next week? Just read the lesson, right? Okay. All right. Thank you all very much.